Hello, everyone. This is episode 7 of Gaming's Lost Memories. I am your host, BigReed, and today we will be talking about the Persona series. The Persona series is a Japanese role playing game that was originally tied to the Shin Megami Tensei series. So, Atlus created it. Shin Megami Tensei is it houses a bunch of different games, all with very similar themes. They're all, like old school Japanese RPGs. Um, they're darker, and they feature a lot of like gods and goddesses and demons and like creatures and things of that nature. Um, Basically all throughout human history and lore. So they basically reference and borrow from just about like all of human history, which is like pretty awesome. But the Persona series was kind of like a branch off of the Shin Megami Tensei series. So kind of what I wanted to talk about because it's a franchise that I absolutely love, and it's one of those. It's not as much of a cult hit anymore because of the information age that we live in, where Persona 5, the praises have been sung. You know what I mean? Like everybody kind of knows of the Persona series. Gamers anyway. I don't think it would be considered mainstream, but it's definitely out there a lot more, and it's so much easier to get the information and everything like that now than what it used to be with either older Shin Megami Tensei games or even like the original Personas. But yeah, it's one of those games where anybody that hasn't played it, but I know they kind of have an infinity for role playing games. I'm like, you got to play Persona. You got to play Persona. Like this game's amazing. Like play these games. Play these games. Like I can't say it enough. um, but it's also kind of interesting because like myself and I think with a lot of other people out there, kind of discovered the series, um, you know, kind of halfway through. So Persona 3, and Persona 3 is one of my favorite games ever. But honestly, all of them are good in their own right. But what's really interesting is I kind of just discovered it. I don't want to say accidentally, but I was in the military, so this is around the time that Persona came out, and there's a lot of downtime. You know what I mean? So like if you're not doing something and you're not actually doing like military stuff, then you have some downtime. So my buddy and I, my roommate and I, were in the barracks, and I'll never forget this. But I'm looking over in the Persona series, and I would say SMT in general, but Persona in particular, has a unique style and flair visually and with audio as well that just kind of like grabs you. So I don't even remember what I'm playing at this point, but I'm looking over and I'm watching this game, and 3, 4, and 5 each have their own very unique, flashy style. 5 being like probably like the coolest and flashiest, but they also have like a color that kind of like that represents the game almost. So going with starting with Persona 3, it's like a light blue. Then you have yellow for Persona 4, and then red, like red and black for Persona 5, mainly red. But what's super interesting is I'm just like watching this, and the music's incredible, and I'm like watching this like turn-based battle go on the screen. And I think at the time with Persona 3, you couldn't control your party fully, which I like. So hear me out in a second. But I just remember I'm like looking at it, and I'm like not even playing my game. Like my game's paused. And I'm just like watching him play this, and he's just sitting there. I don't think we're allowed to smoke in the barracks, but I'm pretty sure he was smoking. Shout out to Ruts, rest in peace. I miss him every day. But I remember him like playing the game, and I'm like watching, and I'm like, what is that? And he's like, I don't know. It's some game called Persona 3. He's like, I found it at GameStop. So this is back when they were still selling like PS2 games and stuff. And I'm just like looking at it, and I can't remember who said it, but one of us looks at the other and we're like, is there a Persona 1? Uh, and there was. So we talked about Persona being part of the Shin Megami Tensei series. Well, we're gonna. It was originally going to be called Revelations Persona, which it was. So that's what it was called. But instead of Shin Megami Tensei for the West, it was going to be Revelations. And there was another game that was released under that moniker. Persona was released under that moniker. Yeah, originally instead of Shin Megami Tensei, it was going to be called Revelations Persona. Now here's where it gets tricky. So I know in the past I have talked about this, but with Japanese games, and this is kind of like, like so many gaming companies kind of came out of Japan, and I would say the roots of the modern video game industry. So starting with like the NES, when Nintendo kind of came in and they were like, okay, we're gonna fix up this video game industry that has crashed like 6 times. Like we're gonna change this, and this is like a brand new start. So I would say that so many of the roots of the modern video game industry are Japanese. So Nintendo, you take Mario for example, and you know Mario's Mario. He's based off of Shigeru Miyamoto's landlord, so he's like some Italian guy, which is really funny by the way. But Mario's Mario. Like Mario to a Western audience doesn't need changed. Like really, like you don't really have to do much to localize it, so to speak, quote unquote. However, with heavy text based role playing games and story based games that are coming out of Japan, there's a localization. So, with the localization, right, they'll generally translate it first, but then what they try to do is change words that like we might not have for Japanese words or vice versa, and they try to make it more digestible or appealing for a different audience based upon the cultures, essentially, right? So, uh, what's kind of cool if you watch anime or read manga, you'll get like a translation, right? So you can have a really rough translation, which will give you kind of like an understanding as to what's happening. But sometimes like you'll read it and it almost sounds like robotic because it hasn't been localized. Localization is when you take that translation and you kind of craft it towards like the new culture or new audience. Okay. So that's difficult with games like Persona or Shin Megami Tensei, and it's expensive. So, kind of what happened with the first one. Is there a Persona 1? There is, and boy, what we got is weird. So, this is kind of where I'm very open and I encourage people that have never experienced a franchise. So, Zelda, Shin Megami Tensei, Mario, like whatever it is, whatever your entry into it, as long as you get to have those experiences as well, that makes me happy. So if I'm in a friendly debate online and somebody has only played, say Pokemon Sword and Shield, then I'm like, okay, well, you're missing a lot of context. So here's why, like, I feel this way, about these games, or I think context is huge, especially like in the gaming industry. But the flip side is if you're saying, "Hey, this is my first Pokemon game. I'm super excited," or "This is my first," like, let the gates open, bring everybody in. I want everybody to experience, awesome games. And Persona felt that way to me. So, if Atlus had left Persona at Persona 1, my goodness, would we have all missed out on a ton of awesome video games, them changing their entire localization process. And honestly, I think the Western audience, it's the healthiest it's ever been for your really like small or low budget, Japanese games. I think there's a market out there, and with the internet, it's so much nicer to be able to get information and know what's coming out, and praying, you don't have to go back 20 years and pray that a gaming magazine you like is going to pick up this game that's only going to sell 100,000 copies. So all of this has been awesome, not only for Atlus and Persona and Shin Megami Tensei, but for the video game industry just in general. Like if you're making a specific product, or you're making a JRPG, like there's going to be a market for it now, and you can kind of reach those people, which is absolutely phenomenal. But if everything would have, if Persona 1 would have been kind of the standard for the series, now it's a cult hit, don't get me wrong, and Atlus has made this right, but it came out on the PlayStation. We looked it up, and I'm just like, what is going on here? And the more you read about the localization, the crazier it gets. So at one point, like, this is probably like the worst part, but at one point, they actually changed the ethnicity of a character to kind of match the Western audience more, which that's just really an interesting choice, because I don't think it's a good thing with how it was done, because I don't think it was done for the right reasons. Um, but yeah, they changed characters. They changed how they look. They lightened their skin. They made characters blonde. So basically, what they're trying to do is pretend this game didn't take place in Japan. Which, if you have ever played any of the Persona games, Could you imagine if everyone just pretended it didn't happen in Japan? Like it's all very clearly heavily Japanese influenced. Like I fired up Persona 5 recently, and like you're using the subway system, like the train system basically. Like that just doesn't really exist where I live at all. Like you cannot go and take a train anywhere. That's just not a mode of transportation. And like everybody's just like walking around, and it's just the way the classrooms are set up, all of the Japanese names, like how like it would just be absolutely fascinating if they continued doing that with their localization process. But luckily they didn't, because if you were to play the original, not only did they cut content from the game, it had a really weird localization. Like they changed the names of everything. They pretended it wasn't in Japan. So thank goodness, that they stuck with it. Persona 2, which I think I have both copies of the PSP version. They remade them on PSP. I don't think I've completed them. It was one of those things where I just liked collecting it. But my entry was definitely with Persona 3. So it probably explains like why I feel that way. I'm like, well, thankfully I was able to play this game, and now I can sing the praises to everybody else, and I can't recommend the games enough. But with Persona 3, I just remember, Ruts and I looking at each other. Is there Persona 1? And we look back and we're like, yeah, but it's weird. Like, what is going on here? Because I'm looking at all the names and I'm like, it's okay. Like you can have Japanese names and everything like that. We'll get used to it. But it's funny too because even Shin Megami Tensei, I remember. Oh my gosh, I remember going into GameStop and seeing. Oh, I'm gonna cry. Collector's editions of SMT games, and like they had one copy of something. I don't even know what it was. I don't think it might have been Digital Devil Saga, which I have, but I didn't get the collector's edition. But just sitting there, it's probably like so rare now, and they had it there for months and months. And I just remember seeing Shin Megami Tensei, and I was just like, what's that mean?" But what's so like interesting about this is Persona eventually became its own thing. So with the popularity and kind of the style of the game, it's very very clearly in the Shin Megami Tensei realm. With three, having played like Shin Megami Tensei 4 and 5 and a lot of the other like spin-off games like Devil Survivor on the DS, which is a fantastic SRPG. That's another game if you haven't played Devil Survivor. There's two of them. If you can find a copy, I know they go for a lot now, but play those games. They're incredible. But with Shin Megami Tensei, and I feel like I'm having a brain fart now. But long story short, Persona eventually became its own thing. Like it can stand on its own legs now. So Persona 5 has shed the SMT moniker, which is really interesting, but also kind of understandable. But the funny thing is when you play the games, it's like, yeah, this feels like an SMT game. Like it's a little bit more lighthearted. Where sheesh, like you play through some of the SMT games, and you ever hear that old like joke about JRPGs? It's like, you know, chapter 1, I'm a farm boy with amnesia, and then chapter 20, time to kill God. And that's kind of like how the games are. Like the games, like they're very serious and they're about chaos and choice. So chaos represents choice. You can choose, and there's no rules. And then the other side, lawliness or law. um, you know be obedient and follow the rules. Like it's very intriguing and interesting. But eventually, um, I played Persona 3. So something happened, and Ruts was like, "Hey, here's my TV. I'm gonna be gone for a little bit, and here's my copy of Persona." I'm like, "Okay." So I was playing Persona 3 on like this 20 or 21-inch quote unquote HD TV. I don't know if it was any of those, but I just remember like stretching the game out. I don't know. Like the resolution was like terrible because I stretched it out, but I was like, this looks fine. But playing the game, like holy smokes. So with the Persona series, 3 through 5, we'll kind of start there, and I guess all of them. But I played 3, 4, and 5 a lot. So Persona 3, it's very dark, and they made some very interesting choices with it. But it follows, a group of high school students, and you have your personas slash your demons, from the SMT series. So they're basically, a lot of them are the same. So there's some new ones, obviously. But the persona kind of like represents your other self. So using what's called an evoker, which looks like a handgun, you kind of you put it towards your head and pull the trigger, And when you do that, you're able to, summon your persona, which is like this demon monster thing, your other self that's inside of you that's super strong and allows you to, fight these other monsters that are out there. Because what's happening is there's a dark hour that's, I want to say, between like midnight and 1 o'clock. It's like an extra hour where, everybody that's out goes into coffins and basically goes to sleep. But the people that don't go to sleep have the ability to summon a persona and like fight these shadows or these monsters that are like roaming around out there and, ultimately, trying to destroy the world. Or maybe maybe that statement leaves a little bit to be kind of explained. But long story short, it also introduced other elements too. So probably one of the most notable, which I think allows Persona to kind of stand on its own legs, are the social links. So there's characters. So not only in your team of Persona wielders, like the people that you control in battle and everything like that. Like you can build rapport and relationships with them, but also other characters that you meet, either at school or just out and about, or in the case of Persona 3, online video games. And they level 1 through 10. So like once you experience them, you kind of establish, a bond with them, and you can grow that bond until it's unbreakable, which means like you maxed out that social link. And if you max out social links, there's personas in those social links. So it leads back to like the gameplay. So you have this like, I hate saying dating sim, because I really like anybody that's played a dating sim, it's not Persona. Like it's just, they're a very unique style of gameplay, but they have similar elements. So saying that, I don't mean it as like oh, this is just a dating sim, but they're similar. Like you can, give them items, gifts they might like, spending time with them, selecting the right options during, like dialogue and everything like that. You'll build your rapport. The more you hang out with them, you build that social link. So with those social links, like say it's level 9, if you fuse a persona, so the fusion system comes back from Shin Megami Tensei, but if you fuse a persona, you get a level bonus, because it's like, whoa, it's level 9. Here's this huge bonus. Like your persona might level up like 11 times after you fuse it. So they kind of tie those relationships back into the core gameplay, which is a turn-based Japanese role-playing game. But it's just really dark and fascinating. So 3, 4, and 5 all have their own feelings, you know what I mean? And all of them, they're M-rated games. So what's really interesting is like you see like, high school characters and like all this crazy stuff happening, but the games are incredibly mature. And Persona 3 is dark. Like if you want to be sad with the story, but like happy at the same time, it's like so bittersweet. I saw somebody on the Persona 3 subreddit, and they're like, I just finished the game, and they're like, oh my god, the feels, like this game has destroyed me. And that's how I felt when I completed it for the first time. I was just like, geez, like I have to go about my day now. It's like, this is impossible. But the games are long, and what's really interesting about the Persona series is the time that Atlus allows and for the character to develop relationships and embrace this story, so you feel all of it. Where sometimes, if say you play like an action game that has cutscenes and it's maybe like 7 or 8 hours long, like you're kind of watching this stuff play out and then playing gameplay. So you're kind of like watching a story, so to speak. But, with a game that's, geez, they could be, okay. I did my second playthrough in like 50 or 60 hours, like 60 hours maybe. My first playthrough was like 100. So that kind of puts it into perspective. The games are kind of long. Now, one thing I will say, if I could wave a magic wand, I might slightly shorten the games up, but just a little bit. But on the flip side, I think one of the benefits that the developer has kind of like crafted with these games now is like you experience these games so long that you're so much more tied to the story and so much more tied to the characters. Like you really are experiencing this, and you're building relationships with these characters, like literally like, maxing out their social link. So it really feels like they're a part of you once you walk away. And there have not been many games that have made me feel those types of feelings and experience, those types of emotions where you're just like, dang, like I care about these characters and I care what's happening in the story. And if there's like something not good that happens, which the games do, like they do not shy away from, having, it's not all hunky dory and just happy endings. You know what I mean? Or they're not afraid to have you experience a good story. Um, but with Persona 3 in particular, like looking back now, having played, 3, 4, and 5. So 5 just came out on the Switch, so this is my third copy I purchased. And Persona 3 and Portable and Persona 4 Golden are coming out in January, basically on everything. So it's going to be so fascinating, and I'm really happy, and I really do hope that more people kind of get to experience these games, and the people that have played them like 20 times, like myself, aren't just the ones coming back. I hope it really does, bring in a new crowd that gets to experience these games. But Persona 3 in particular, it has you climbing this giant tower called Tartarus. So you're fighting shadows at night, and every once in a while, like on the full moon of every month, and the game plays out through, I want to say like 9 months or a year or something like that. I can't remember how long. But you play each day, and there's a limited number of time. So time isn't constantly moving like on a real clock. But if go to school for the day, like it'll be afternoon, and in the afternoon you can hang out with somebody, and it'll progress to night, and then at nighttime you can either build a social link or go explore Tartarus. But Tartarus is this giant tower, and I think it's at the school, but it's this giant tower, and as you go through, there's all these shadows and there's floor bosses. Like, it's really interesting, and the design of 3 is more grindy than 4 and 5. So I think they kind of, like, I don't want to say fix this, but I feel like you climbing Tartarus is kind of symbolic, in terms of like the character as well, and also like the way that the story goes. So it's really intriguing. So you climb Tartarus. There's basically just Tartarus, and there's like different blocks as you progress the story. And then once per full moon is like when this giant shadow comes, and like, you guys see it on the radar. You go, you fight it, etc. So like you're just trying to, like, keep everything in check and eliminate these shadows from like harming people. Persona 4, instead of Tartarus, there were, not palaces, because I think they're called palaces in 5. But basically, you go into it, and it only has so many floors. There's an end to it, and you basically, go through it, and at the end, the character unlocks their persona and has an epiphany. Like, it's how you like kind of unlock your characters. And then Persona 5, I believe they were called palaces, where it was like distorted versions of people's hearts. So, how they truly were, and you're trying to like change how they feel, because generally, like when you're in the palaces, the people aren't doing like really great things. But what's really interesting too, like one of the overall themes we talked about was the social links, and they do a really good job of having different characters, and some are more, intriguing or more memorable than others. However, you kind of get to experience, their story. So for example, in Persona 3, there's, one of the characters is like the dying young man. So you go to the park on, Sunday or whatever, and he's just like hanging out there. And the more that you talk to him, he's dying, and you kind of get to learn about him and experience him and everything like that. Or, like the little girl character at the park as well. And, you're hanging out with her, just spending time with her, and you realize like her parents are arguing and fighting and like causing, issues there. But also like building up your party members too. So they do a really good job of creating complex characters that aren't all good, aren't all bad, that, have their desires, have their things they want to be happy, or have things that they need to personally overcome themselves to be the best version of themselves that they can be. And that's kind of like the persona moniker as well. Your inner selves, with the main characters generally being able to fuse and use any persona, where a lot of the other characters basically only have their one or a souped up version, like as you kind of like progress the story. But yeah, the games are just really interesting. And I remember in Persona 3, this is like a small side thing that like kind of cracks me up. Persona 3, the original one, you couldn't control your characters fully. So here's where that's bad. If the AI is bad, or the AI is doing something stupid in a fight, then it's not great, because the way the games work is, say a monster is weak to wind attacks and you use a wind attack, it'll knock them down and you'll get a bonus turn. So like you really want to balance that out, especially for like bosses and everything like that, because the games don't mess around. Now, there are different difficulty settings, and I know so Persona also has a habit of Atlus will listen to feedback, and then they will release like a special version. So Persona 3 was Persona 3 FES, Persona 4 was Persona 4 Golden, and Persona 5 was Persona 5 Royal. Um, but they enhance the game and they add features that people had requested, which that's a gutsy move, but it also it's interesting because you can play, say, Persona 5 and then play Persona 5 Royal like later and be like, yeah, it's like my send off. Like they did these enhancements, they did these cool things, they added these things, they changed up social links, they tweaked gameplay. It's kind of interesting, and you don't see it. I mean, I guess you do see like Game of the Year editions, but Atlus is really good at listening to feedback and making improvements, where they need to. Um, oh, so Atlus doesn't shy away from, making enhancements or changes to the games if they need to, which is really cool because, like, later on in Persona 3 Portable, for example, you got a female route, which I think was really good because it's like, hey, if you want to experience Persona 3, closer to the core experience, you play the male characters route. But then, if you've already played that game once before, you can try this like whole new perspective, and that's like really cool. Um, but you can't control your party members in the original Persona 3. And I actually turn that off. So having full control, I turn that off except for boss fights now because they do so well at making your party members feel like real people and having like emotional impact on you that I like them to be controlled because it makes them feel more like themselves, if that makes sense. It's like I want them to be their own independent people, which is really interesting because if I told you, hey, I'm gonna have a computer control 75% of your character party, you might be like, get out of town. So that's where, depending on the difficulty that you're playing on, it might not be too much of an issue, but also you can change it at any time. So normally what I'll do is if I'm going into a boss fight or a more tough fight, I'll have like player control because you kind of just have to be honest, especially with some of the boss fights. The games are also tough, and SMTs like this. The games on their natural settings are pretty hard, and they've been making the games more accessible by offering all kinds of different difficulty settings. Like my third playthrough of Persona 5, I'm doing it on whatever the easiest setting is because like at this point, like I just want to experience the story and go through it on the Switch. But if you want to challenge, like the base difficulty on a lot of these games is like tough. Like you got to pay attention and you got to use like I know in a lot of RPGs, sometimes the status elements and like the weird moves, the non-damage dealing moves, like you're just like, I don't really need to use these, but they're super impactful and important in the Persona series, especially with like Persona 3. Like I remember playing the game one time and just dying to a random like boss battle, or not boss battle, excuse me, like a random encounter in Tartarus, and I'm just like, I wasn't really paying attention and I just got off on the wrong foot, and they gave like a status element, and keep in mind there's holy and you know death or darkness attacks. I can't remember, Mudu I think it's called, but yeah, where you'll encounter enemies where if you give them a turn, they cast a instant kill on all four of your party members, and it's just like sometimes it'll hit two of them and you're like, geez, oh man. Like this is bad, and you're fighting like three or four monsters that all have these abilities and they just like spam them over and over, so like you can't mess around. You know what I mean? But Persona 3 also got a PSP version, so here's where it gets a little tricky because I like Persona 3 Portable, but I played Persona 3 and Persona 3 FES. So like you can control your character, meaning they like run around. But on the PSP version, which the other day I went to turn it on. So I think this was on Friday, so a few days ago, and I went to turn it on, and I'm like, oh, it wasn't working. So I go to take my battery out, and my battery just expanded and had died. Like, I mean, geez, that battery's probably like 10 years old or maybe more. maybe like 12 years old. So I had to order a new battery. Luckily, my PSP is working again, so we're all good there. But I was like just trying to play some Persona 3 to like refresh my memory a little bit, and it was just like, nope, you can't do it. Um, so that was always that was pretty interesting as well. But with Persona 3 Portable, they kind of, due to the limitations of the PSP, they took out some of like the anime cutscenes and they did them as stills, so still images. Um, and they would describe kind of like what's happening. They're like, this is a bustling city square, because they're not showing like the actual city square with like people moving like in the anime cutscene. So and you control like a dot, or excuse me, like a circle on the screen, like a cursor. So I, I'm fine with it, and I had a great experience with Persona 3 Portable. I think I beat that game twice, so male and female route. But I don't know if it would be better for people to experience something closer to maybe what FES was, where like you kind of run around like on the map, like because you control them in Tartarus, just not in like the daytime and like social elements. Persona 4 and 5 and like 4 Golden and everything like that, they were on better hardware, the PS2 and the Vita. Persona 5 on like all the modern stuff. So I don't know. It's interesting. I hope people give Persona 3 Portable a shot, but I'm very curious as to somebody experiencing that game for the first time as the portable version, if that is like I'm very curious to see like how they would interpret it and feel about it. I liked it, but I had played Persona 3 kind of originally, but the series kind of now stands on its own, which is really interesting. And there's different themes. Persona 3 is dark and kind of depressing. It focuses a lot on death. Essentially, the world is, what is it, apathy syndrome, I think they call it, where they're basically just turning into like zombies, and like as you progress to the end of the game, there's just more and more people like just standing around like zombies. And there's I'll have spoilers. I won't go into too much detail. I'll include spoilers on this tag for this podcast. But I remember finishing Persona 3, and I was playing Persona 3 Portable, and I think that might have been my first full completion of the game. But I remember I started playing at like 10 p.m. or 11 p.m., and the game just was so good. Like I'm getting closer and closer to the end, and I can feel that I'm getting closer to the end. And like all the stories unraveling, the twists, like everything's just happening. I'm just like, my goodness, like I couldn't put it down. And I remember experiencing the end, and you could call it sad, you could call it tragic, you could call it extremely bittersweet. There's so many things you could call it. I just remember like experiencing all of those feelings and emotions, and I'm like tearing up. I'm like, getting the sniffles. And I just remember like it's starting to become dusk, and I can start hearing like the morning birds chirping, and it's not completely dark anymore. It's still dark, but you can tell the sun's like slowly about to start coming up. And I just remember finishing the game, and I'm like, oh my god, it's quite unlike anything I've ever experienced. It's there's just so many emotions wrapped up in the ending. And Persona 4 and 5 are a lot more lighthearted, even though they deal with some extremely dark themes. Persona 3 has a feeling of not hopelessness, because there is hope, but it's just it's just very dark. It feels, after playing these games and then playing a lot of the Shin Megami Tensei games now, it feels pretty close to an SMT game, like one of the mainline games, or what you would experience. Now you have your lighthearted elements of the social links and stuff like that too, in high school and etc. But Persona 4 had a unique mix, and we talk about like the different colors of the different games, 3, 4, and 5. It was all yellow, and like it's really cool. But it feels like Japanese high school Scooby Doo, but if the mysteries they were solving were murders. So instead of it being like, oh, who's trying to scare the people away from the farm, and it's like, it's Old Man Withers. No, it's like, oh, somebody's dead and they're on top of a building, like caught in this wire. You're like, oh, well, that's bad. But I really like Persona 4 a lot, and I feel like once again they knock it out of the park with the music. The overall games, like the Atlus pays attention to the details with these games. And I feel like so many games you just like don't see it, especially, some of the more modern, like, Japanese RPGs that have like come out. They don't find like their style, so to speak. And I feel like Persona 4 definitely had an awesome style. 5 even more so. But 4 had its like own thing. So like all of these, characters are coming together to solve these mysteries of these murders and everything like that. And everybody's kind of having to overcome something in themselves too, which is like really, really cool the way they do it. And then Golden, of course, got released on the Vita, and they just like souped it up. What's so interesting about Persona 4, and I don't know if this was true with 3, you can get a bad ending really easy. So a lot of the SMT games in general have like multiple endings or paths you can choose. And if you do the bad one, so I think I ended up looking up the bad one, or not the bad one, but like, the less than stellar ending. And it's just like, it feels like there's something looming over you, and then you just kind of like leave and your journey ends, and it's weird. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention in these games too. At this point, as long as you're not spoiling anything, if you look up something and you're like, hey, because you don't want to screw up a part in Persona 4 and get like the mediocre ending, and you're just like, maybe I should play that again. um, you know what I mean? Like you're just like, that wasn't good. But a lot of their games have it. Catherine, another spin-off game, um, has that as well, where that's not really an RPG, but it's like you can get a not so great ending as well. Um, and then Persona 5. So Persona 5 got away from the SMT banner. And it's not good or bad. It just kind of is what it is. You know what I mean? So it's odd because it shares so many things with SMT. And the series came from the SMT banner. But I think at this point, since Persona 3, the series has only gotten more popular, and I think it kind of stands on their own now, because I think there could be people that might be a fan of the Persona series and maybe hasn't played the other SMT games. So I can kind of understand it, but then the flip side is it's like it's very clearly sharing things that are common in all of the SMT games, like the demon, the fusion system, etc. So it's just kind of like interesting. But I think at this point, the series does kind of stand on its own. So I don't see it as a bad thing. It's just an interesting choice. But I think at the end of the day, SMT is going to kind of continue to be more specialized, and your Persona series is going to appeal to, like, there are Persona specific fans now. And once again, let the floodgates open, let everybody come in. Like, if Persona leads you to SMT, awesome. Like, there's so many like cool different experiences and games you can play. So I'm happy. Let everybody in. But yeah, Persona 5. So that just came out on the Switch as well. So replaying it again, and the games are very slow. They take their time and they make sure that they. So I mentioned earlier very briefly that they take place on an actual calendar. So like you start the game and you're gonna go through like each day. So the games are long, and slow. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing because they don't feel that way, because they fragment the gameplay by doing a lot of small little bites. So for example, your character has like 5 stats outside of the RPG elements, and it could be like intelligence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, charisma. Okay, but you can do certain things to level them. You can read books, you can watch movies, you can play games, you answer questions correctly in class, and you can level that up. So you're leveling those things up in small little bite-sized things. Like, oh, I'm going to play this game, and I know it's going to level my charisma, right? So you do that, and then there's your palaces that you go into, that are part of the story and everything like that. So the game's all fragmented into like, little bite size. And I feel like they started that with Persona 3. I think they did that really well. Like one night you would go to Tartarus and just do a bunch of Tartarus stuff. I always recommend, because your characters can get tired, I think. I know that was a thing in 3. Oh my gosh, that's one element in Persona 3 that it's probably good that they took out. Because the game tried to naturally balance itself out. So the longer that you stay in the midnight hour, like in Tartarus, your characters become fatigued, and when they become fatigued, they might not listen to your commands, and they might get knocked down real easy. So like your parties can get wiped out. So it's kind of the game saying like, hey, you need to go and rest. Or if you stay out like super late, like your characters get fatigued, then like you just can't go to Tartarus again and stuff. So it's really interesting. But I think they did away with that. I think in Persona 4 and 5, which is probably better because like you could just find yourself in a really bad situation when all of your characters are just getting destroyed by like basic enemies. Um, but they're slow, and like I said, if I could wave a magic wand, especially like Persona 5, I would trim a little bit off of it, but not too much, because due to how steadily and meticulously the game plays out, and you level these social links and you experience the story, like by the end of it, as they introduce story based elements, it's just like, wow. Like I feel all of this because you had time to build these relationships with these characters, so that way, like as the story elements are happening, like you feel pretty good. I feel like the lack of control in Persona 5, because the whole game's about breaking the shackles of your prison, and becoming the harbinger of change and control, and getting out of this and being rehabilitated and all of that stuff. So I think with that, the game, especially for like the beginning, like it's just like go to bed, go to bed. Like you meet a character called Morgana, it's like go to bed, go to bed, go to bed. So it's like just let me play the game. But I think it was done intentionally. But it is interesting. So I think it might be nice to allow maybe a teeny bit more exploration, when they do Persona 6. But once again, like all of the games are good. And it's hard for me to say, like, don't make the games 90 hours or 100 hours, because once you finally finish them, like, you might feel like you've run a marathon. So, like, you prepare, you play, you put in the hours, and then you finish the marathon, and you're like, I'm so happy I did that. Like, I'm so proud of myself. I'm so happy I got to experience that. That's how the Persona games feel to me. Like, you finish that marathon, and you're like, geez, like the way that I feel about the experience right now, I don't think I would change anything. Which is interesting to say about a 100-hour game. Like, you definitely get your money's worth. You know what I mean? But yeah, the Persona series, it's just super interesting and special, and I think it's a good, to be honest, I think it's a good segue into other Atlus games in the Shin Megami Tensei series. So I feel like it's a good starting point. So I look at it as, because there's some purists, and there's nothing wrong with that, because I understand. Like I talked earlier about context, and if you've been playing, SMT forever, and all of a sudden this like Japanese high school, you know, side game comes out and is super popular and everybody loves it, you know what I mean? And it's getting more kind of more eyes and more focus and attention than maybe like the games that you kind of came up playing, in the series. I could understand a little bit of like being like, hey, look at all these awesome games too. Like you need to experience that too. Um, but I look at it as it's a good segue into it. So if you play, any of the Persona games, and that leads you into maybe trying another SMT game, like I'm all about that, because I feel like the series is just absolutely incredible. And it's old. I think SMT is like 25, 30 years old at this point. Like, I want to say NES or something like that. It might have been on. Maybe I'm wrong there. Maybe it was later, but it was definitely pretty early. But yeah, the games are just absolutely phenomenal. I think they are able to tell a story in a way that's just not done with basically any other, games, and that's why they became so popular and they became cult classics and they became, well known, is because they're doing things that other games aren't doing. And it's really fun watching, going from Persona 3 all the way to 5, just seeing the review scores just, go up and up, and, the sales go higher and higher. Like I think it's absolutely phenomenal. And it's a series of games that you have to experience them. You have to, just play through the social links and play through the story, with an open mind, and just kind of follow these characters on the journey. And it's kind of funny too, because they do have a lot of like, JRPG or anime tropes and everything like that too that are hilarious, but they do it in such a way that it doesn't feel like cheesy, you know what I mean? Because there's in Persona 5, there's a maid character that's like whoa. It's like a curveball, and you're like, but then you get to understand, why that character is, in that like maid service job, and what relevance they have to the main character. And to be honest, all of the main characters are cool too. Now I know a lot of them don't speak directly, like they kind of speak through the choices that you select. And it's funny, Persona 5, I feel like your character does have a voice. I don't remember that in 3. I don't know if they did that in 4. Like your character doesn't really like talk too much, which I think is good. But Persona 3, your character was kind of like they looked kind of like edgy and emo, you know what I mean? Which I like the main character of Persona 3. I think pound for pound, that character's arguably the best of the series, because of how the story unfolds. Persona 4, like you got your like more handsome, like cooler character, and then Persona 5, it's just like not edgy, but like stylistic and very cool. And like your main character Joker, just like they're just awesome, and they know it, and they're kind of not conceited, but they understand that they're like pretty awesome. And the opening cutscene really shows that off, where it's like, like I got this, check this out, and it's like, you're awesome, Joker. But yeah, they're great starting points. It's another thing that's wonderful too, and I think this is really important for the video game industry. You got to get your games on the platforms that are out there. I understand like exclusivity, and that's always going to be out there, but Sega, I think it's Sega Sammy owns Atlus now. I think that's how it is. So they're publishing it. So if I'm looking at that, you have these quality games, like you have so many Atlus games, get them out on anything and everything. And like it shouldn't be, I have a Switch and I'm waiting for this game to come out. Like find a way to get it to launch at the same time, or within the launch window at least, because the market's out there. And if you don't do that, you're only harming yourself by eliminating potential, fans or players or sales of the game, because there's already a good amount of people buying it on Switch. And honestly, like how much money did it cost to freaking port it over? Probably not a lot. So yeah, it's really great. So Persona 5 is basically on everything now. And then Persona 3 Portable and Persona 4 Golden in January of this coming year. You're going to see, those released on other consoles as well. So it might be fun. I don't know if I would play them all back to back again, just due to time constraints, but I definitely want to replay 4 as well, just because I feel like the last time I played it was on the Vita. So I've played that one. It's been the longest since I played that one. 5 is the most recent, and then 3, I think a few years ago, I completed 3 a second time. But there's really no wrong way to experience the games. Get into them, take your time with them, and it's easy to do so because the games, are longer. But what I mean is, like, don't try to do everything in one playthrough. I think technically, on a technicality, you can, but the games are designed to be played through again. So, like, if there's like social links you didn't complete or things you wanted to do differently, you can, and you carry over the progress of the social links and the character stats outside of combat, and I think you carry over your personas too. So it's like you can go through the game again pretty quickly. But there's just nothing quite like them, and I think Atlus needs to continue to, embrace at the core of what the games are. Don't do the Persona 1 and try to pretend they're not in Japan. Like, they're Japanese games. They take place in Japan, like, as opposed to what they did with 1 and trying to pretend and, like, change, the ethnicity of characters and, like, change how they are, change the names. Like, teach. You know what I mean? And I think JRPGs and Atlus especially have been doing a really good job of kind of doing that. Like, teach your new audience, because the audience is there, and the product that you have is just absolutely incredible. And like I said, it's just been so wonderful, singing, the Persona series praise from the rooftops, like, just play the series. This will get you into SMT. Play this. Like, so it's awesome seeing the games become more popular and more accessible to everyone out there. But yeah, the Persona series is amazing. Persona 3, 4, and 5. Play them. Play Persona 3. Play any of them. But if you can give Persona 3 a shot, it's actually interesting going back, even though the games are more. I think they're more closely linked to SMT in terms of difficulty, and also maybe some more archaic elements to the series that they kind of have done away with recently. But I think it also kind of puts it into perspective because it's like, whoa, this game is like more difficult, it's darker, and I just think the ending was just absolutely phenomenal and like, it just had me emotional. I'm like, oh my god, like I still can't believe that's kind of like where they left it off. But there's been a lot of spin-off games too. Now, the spin-off games I haven't played too much. I think I played was it Persona Labyrinth, Persona Q, the Persona Q series. Played that a little bit. Um, there's like dancing games and everything like that. But I mean, if that brings more people to the franchise, then that's fine. Games I haven't played myself, but the core experiences are absolutely phenomenal. So I highly recommend if you like video games or especially if you like RPGs and you haven't played Persona, holy crap, play Persona, then dive into SMT because you're in for a treat because there's nothing quite like those experiences out there. But that'll wrap up this podcast. I really appreciate you talking with me today. Once again, this is Big Reed, and this was another episode of Gaming's Lost Memories.